Picture this. You are standing in the shadowy corner of a candlelit chamber in Wiener Neustadt on Christmas Eve, 1634. The air hangs thick with incense and the metallic scent of blood. Outside, snow falls silently on cobblestone courtyards where Habsburg eagles perch frozen on iron gates. Inside, a midwife's weathered hands lift a newborn infant from silk-stained sheets, and in that moment, you witness the first breath of a child destined to become the most inbred queen in European history. The baby's cry pierces the winter air, a sound that will echo through palaces from Vienna to Madrid. Her name is Mariana, daughter of Ferdinand III, future Holy Roman Emperor, and Maria Anna of Spain. But names mean nothing yet. What matters is the blood coursing through those tiny veins, blood so concentrated with Habsburg ancestry that it carries within it the seeds of an empire's destruction. The attending physicians murmur prayers in Latin, while courtiers whisper behind tapestried walls. They see what they've been trained to see, the distinctive features already emerging, the unmistakable signs of royal breeding that mark her as legitimate heir to the most powerful dynasty in Europe. But you, watching from the shadows, understand what they cannot. This child will cross the Alps to marry her own uncle, Philip IV of Spain. She will mother the king whose twisted body will end 3 centuries of Spanish Habsburg rule. Before we dive deeper into this story, take a moment to hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible that across centuries, we're connected by our fascination with these dark chapters of royal history. The midwife cleans the infant's face, revealing features that will one day grace portraits across Spanish palaces. Features that artists will learn to paint with careful diplomacy, emphasizing nobility while obscuring the telltale signs of what happens when bloodlines become too pure, too closed, too concentrated. But this is only the beginning of Mariana's story. You step into the map room of the Hofburg Palace, where massive charts stretch across oak tables, showing Habsburg territories scattered across Europe like pieces of a broken mirror. Here, in rooms thick with tobacco smoke and ambition, the marriage politics of the 16th and 17th centuries were decided not by love, but by the cold arithmetic of power. The logic seemed flawless. Keep the land, keep the titles, keep the bloodline pure. Uncle marries, niece, cousin weds cousin, and the family tree becomes less a tree than a twisted vine choking itself. Philip II had married his niece Anna of Austria. Their son, Philip III, married his cousin Margaret. Now, Philip IV would marry his niece Mariana, creating a genetic knot so tight it would strangle future generations. Contemporary portraits reveal the Habsburg strategy in oil and gold leaf. Those distinctive features, the prominent jaw, the heavy-lidded eyes, the pale complexion, were reframed by court artists as marks of divine appointment. What we might recognize as warning signs, they painted as proof of legitimacy. The family look became a political brand, instantly recognizable across European courts. But estimates suggest that by Mariana's generation, the coefficient of inbreeding among Spanish Habsburgs had reached extraordinary levels. Where the general population carried virtually no shared ancestry between parents, Habsburg marriages created genetic overlap that would make even Renaissance physicians uncomfortable had they understood what they were witnessing. The marriage contracts read like business mergers. This duchy for that claim, this province for that inheritance. Children were commodities, their bloodlines more valuable than gold mines in Peru. Mariana's betrothal to her uncle Philip was arranged before she could walk. Her fate sealed by signatures on parchment that treated human beings as political chess pieces. Yet the architects of these unions saw only strength in their isolation. The Spanish court convinced itself that purity equaled power, that the concentrated Habsburg blood flowing through royal veins made them closer to God than common mortals. They built their strategy on a foundation of biological quicksand, and the cracks were already beginning to show in nurseries across Europe. The bill would come due in council chambers and christening fonts. But for now, young Mariana remained a pawn in a game whose rules guaranteed that everyone would lose. 1649. You stand in the Cathedral of St. Stephen in Vienna, watching a 15-year-old girl marry a man who isn't there. Mariana of Austria, dressed in silver brocade that catches candlelight like captured stars, exchanges vows with Spanish ambassador representing her uncle Philip IV. This proxy ceremony is political theater, but the legal bonds being forged are real as iron shackles. The journey to Spain stretches across the Alps like a procession of the damned. Carriages lumber through mountain passes where avalanches wait like sleeping giants. Mariana travels with a retinue of Austrian servants who will be dismissed the moment she crosses the Spanish border, their familiar faces replaced by strangers loyal to a court she's never seen. Near Madrid, the formal entry transforms the Spanish countryside into an outdoor cathedral. Period accounts describe pageantry that bankrupted local treasuries. Arches of roses, fountains running wine, entire villages conscripted to wave flags and cheer for a queen they've been commanded to love. But beneath the celebration, court observers noted something unsettling in the young bride's bearing, a hesitance that suggested she understood exactly what kind of marriage awaited her. The wedding itself was both magnificent and grotesque. Philip IV, 44 years old and weary from decades of war, stood beside his teenage niece in robes that couldn't disguise his declining health. Mariana, barely past childhood herself, would become stepmother to Maria Theresa, Philip's daughter from his first marriage, who was practically her own age. Spanish court etiquette demanded that she learn a new language of submission. Where Austrian courts allowed some freedom of movement and expression, Spanish protocol treated queens like religious relics, precious but untouchable. Every gesture was prescribed, every conversation monitored, every moment choreographed according to rules written in blood centuries earlier. The culture shock must have been devastating. One day she was Archduchess of Austria, raised in relatively informal Germanic traditions. The next, she was Queen of Spain, trapped in ceremonial amber, where even her prayers were subject to scrutiny by confessors appointed by the king. But Mariana adapted, because adaptation was survival. She learned to navigate the labyrinth of Spanish court politics where every smile concealed a dagger and every courtesy masked potential treason. Yet her most crucial test still lay ahead, in the royal nursery where the fate of empires would be decided by biology. You enter the royal nursery at the Alcazar Palace, where destiny hangs in the air like incense, mixed with fear. The stakes could not be higher. Spain desperately needs male heirs, and all of Europe watches Mariana's womb as closely as they monitor battlefield dispatches. Every pregnancy becomes a diplomatic event, every birth a potential reshuffling of the continental power balance. Her first child, Margaret Theresa, arrives in 1651 like a small miracle wrapped in Habsburg features. The infant survives, grows, and will eventually marry Leopold I, Mariana's own brother, completing another loop in the family's genetic spiral. But daughters, however beloved, cannot inherit Spain. The dynasty needs sons. Maria Ambrosia follows in 1655, but death claims her within months. Contemporary records, written with diplomatic caution, describe the infant's brief life in terms that suggest she carried the visible burden of her ancestry. Court physicians, trained in discretion, refer obliquely to complications that made survival unlikely from birth. Philip Prospero arrives in 1657 like an answer to desperate prayers. For 4 years, he represents hope incarnate, the future king who will justify every calculated marriage, every concentrated bloodline, every sacrifice made on the altar of dynastic purity. Palace artists paint him in miniatures that emphasize health and Habsburg legitimacy. But at 4 years old, allegedly carrying genetic burdens too heavy for his small frame, he dies, taking Spain's dreams with him into the tomb. Ferdinand Tomas barely survives his first year, born in 1658 and dead before 1659. The royal physicians maintain careful silence about the specifics, but whispered court gossip speaks of infants who arrive already marked by their ancestry, bearing in their tiny bodies the accumulated cost of centuries of inbreeding. Each funeral procession through Madrid becomes a public meditation on mortality and dynasty. Citizens line the streets, watching miniature coffins carried by grandees, understanding that their empire's future dies with these Habsburg children. The Spanish court maintains its facade of divine appointment, but privately, even the most loyal courtiers begin to whisper about curses and consequences. Then, in 1661, Charles arrives. Charles II, who will be called El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He lives, but at what cost? Even as an infant, observers noted the distinctive features that mark him unmistakably as Habsburg, while suggesting that the family's genetic account has finally come due. The child who survives carries within his twisted frame the arithmetic of 3 centuries of calculated inbreeding. Court physicians surround him with prayers and relics, but you can see what they cannot. This infant represents both the culmination and the terminus of Habsburg Spain's experiment with bloodline purity. 1665. You stand in the throne room of the Alcazar as Philip IV draws his final breath, leaving behind a 31-year-old widow and a 4-year-old boy who must somehow shoulder the crown of the world's largest empire. Mariana of Austria, draped in the black silk that will define the rest of her life, becomes regent for young Charles II, and in that moment transforms from ornamental queen to the most powerful woman in Europe. The Junta de Gobierno, Spain's governing council, meets in chambers where sunlight filters through windows like golden dust, settling on political ambitions. These men, grey-bearded veterans of Philip's wars, must now take orders from a woman they've watched grow from teenage bride to widowed mother. The irony is not lost on any of them. The most inbred queen in European history now holds together an empire stretching from Madrid to Manila. Her first major decision reveals both her intelligence and her vulnerability. She elevates Juan Everardo Nithard, her Jesuit confessor, to chief minister. Nithard, an Austrian like herself, brings Germanic efficiency to Spanish administration, but his foreign origins and religious zealotry create immediate opposition among Spanish grandees who see him as proof of Austrian interference in Spanish affairs. The external pressures mount like storm clouds on every horizon. Louis XIV's France launches the War of Devolution in 1667, claiming Spanish territories in the Low Countries through his marriage to Mariana's stepdaughter Maria Teresa. Portuguese independence, long contested, receives formal recognition in the Treaty of Lisbon in 1668, amputating another piece of Spanish territory. Mariana navigates these crises while managing the impossible arithmetic of imperial finance. The silver fleets from Peru arrive irregularly. Spanish armies demand payment for campaigns they're losing, and European creditors circle Madrid like vultures sensing carrion. She signs treaties, negotiates loans, and maintains the fiction of Spanish power while watching the empire's foundations crumble beneath her feet. Her balancing act requires skills no royal education could have provided. She must appear strong enough to command European respect while vulnerable enough to elicit Habsburg family support from Vienna. She maintains Spanish court protocol while secretly corresponding with her brother Leopold about coordinating Austrian and Spanish policy against French expansion. But her greatest challenge emerges not from foreign courts, but from within her own family. Don Juan of Austria the Younger, Philip IV's illegitimate son, begins gathering support among Spanish nobles who resent Austrian influence and question a woman's capacity to rule. He represents everything Mariana is not: Spanish-born, militarily experienced, and male in a culture that still sees female rule as an unnatural aberration. The palace becomes a chessboard where every conversation carries hidden meanings and every appointment signals political allegiance. Mariana learns to speak in diplomatic code, to smile while calculating, to project maternal devotion while wielding imperial authority. She surrounds herself with loyalists while identifying potential traitors, maintaining the appearance of serene confidence, while navigating conspiracies that could destroy both her regency and her son's inheritance. The widow in black becomes a master of survival in a court where showing weakness meant political death. But Don Juan grows stronger with each Spanish military defeat, each economic crisis, each moment when foreign observers question whether a woman can truly govern the Spanish Empire. 1669, you watch from a palace balcony as crowds gather in Madrid's Plaza Mayor, their chants echoing off stone walls like war drums. Down with the Austrian. They scream, and you realize that Mariana's worst nightmare is materializing in broad daylight. Don Juan of Austria the Younger has turned Spanish patriotism into a weapon aimed directly at the Queen Mother's heart. The pressure becomes unbearable when even the church turns against Nithard. Spanish bishops, manipulated by Don Juan's supporters, declare that foreign influence in Spanish governance violates divine law. Mariana faces an impossible choice: defend her confessor and risk civil war, or sacrifice him and appear weak before European courts. She chooses survival over loyalty. Nithard's expulsion from Madrid becomes a public humiliation choreographed for maximum impact. The former chief minister leaves the capital in a simple carriage, his Austrian efficiency replaced by Spanish contempt. Don Juan's faction celebrates his departure like a military victory, and in truth, that's exactly what it represents. But Mariana proves more resilient than her enemies anticipated. She replaces Nithard with Fernando de Valenzuela, a Spanish nobleman whose family credentials satisfy court traditionalists, while his personal loyalty to the Queen Mother ensures Austrian interests remain protected. Valenzuela lacks Nithard's theological training but possesses something equally valuable: the ability to appear Spanish while thinking Austrian. The 1670s become a decade of shadow warfare between the Queen Mother and the king's bastard half-brother. Don Juan commands military support and appeals to Spanish nationalism. Mariana controls the treasury and speaks with young Charles's voice. Each side maneuvers for advantage while maintaining the fiction of familial unity. Contemporaries accused both sides of plotting assassination, though evidence remains circumstantial. What's certain is that palace guards loyal to different factions begin avoiding each other in corridors, that food tasters multiply around both Mariana and Don Juan, and that Madrid takes on the atmosphere of a city under siege from within. 1677 brings the crisis to its climax. Don Juan marches on Madrid with an army of supporters, forcing a confrontation that threatens to tear the monarchy apart. Mariana, recognizing that resistance might mean civil war, agrees to withdraw to Toledo while Don Juan assumes the position of First Minister. The Queen Mother's exile becomes another public humiliation, but also a strategic retreat. From Toledo, Mariana maintains correspondence with European courts while appearing to accept defeat gracefully. She watches Don Juan attempt to govern Spain while managing the impossible tensions between military necessity and fiscal reality. Distance provides perspective. Ruling is harder than seizing power. 1679 delivers unexpected salvation. Don Juan dies suddenly, possibly from illness, possibly from poison, definitely at the moment when his removal serves Mariana's interests perfectly. His death removes her greatest rival, while creating a power vacuum only she can fill. Mariana returns to Madrid like a queen rising from the tomb. Her black silk gowns become symbols of endurance rather than mourning. She has survived the palace war and emerges more powerful than before, but the cost of victory shows in new lines around her eyes and silver threading through her hair. You stand outside the royal bedchamber in the dead of night, listening to sounds that make your blood run cold. Not passion, but something closer to desperation. Inside those silk-curtained walls, the future of European civilization depends on the conjugal success of a king whose twisted body carries the accumulated burden of 3 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. As Queen Mother, Mariana brokers Charles II's first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orléans in 1679. The French princess arrives in Madrid like a ray of sunshine in a tomb, young and healthy, and tragically unprepared for what awaits her. Mariana watches the wedding ceremony knowing that everything depends on this union producing heirs, but fearing what she's witnessed in royal nurseries suggests biology may have other plans. Months pass, then years. Marie-Louise's monthly cycles become subjects of diplomatic correspondence. European ambassadors report on the Queen's health like military intelligence. Every missed period raises hopes. Every appearance of blood dashes dreams. The Spanish court surrounds the royal couple with prayers, relics, and physicians whose remedies range from the merely useless to the actively harmful. Contemporary letters allegedly describe increasingly desperate measures, exorcisms performed in secret chambers, medical examinations that violate every principle of royal dignity, pilgrimages to shrines where infertile couples supposedly find miraculous fertility. The line between medicine and magic blurs when the patient wears a crown and the diagnosis threatens dynastic survival. Marie-Louise dies in 1689, taking with her 10 years of dashed hopes. Her death, whether from illness or other causes, removes the last obstacle to a second marriage that might yet provide Spanish heirs. Mariana, now in her 50s, must again play matchmaker for a son whose peculiarities grow more pronounced with each passing year. Maria Anna of Neuburg arrives from Germany in 1690, another young princess sacrificed to the altar of dynastic necessity. This second wedding lacks the optimism of the first. Everyone understands the stakes, but few expect success. Maria Anna's German practicality clashes with Spanish mysticism, creating yet another layer of dysfunction in an already impossible situation. The new Queen's bedchamber becomes a theater of national anxiety. Court physicians allegedly conduct examinations that would shock modern sensibilities. Confessors prescribe spiritual remedies alongside medical treatments. The Spanish nobility debates whether the problem lies with the king, the queen, or divine displeasure with the Habsburg bloodline itself. Years pass without conception. European courts begin serious discussions about Spanish succession, treating Charles as effectively dead despite his continued breathing. Mariana watches her son's marriages become international humiliations, while maintaining the fiction that Spanish royal fertility remains merely delayed, not destroyed. The question haunting every European capital becomes unavoidable. Who inherits Spain when the Spanish king cannot produce Spanish heirs? The answer will reshape the continent, but first, it will destroy the dynasty that created the problem through 3 centuries of calculated inbreeding. Behind closed doors, Mariana surely understands what history will confirm. Her son represents the biological terminus of Spanish Habsburg rule, but understanding and accepting are different things, and she continues fighting for a dynasty already dead in everything but name. 1690. You enter the private correspondence chamber, where Mariana maintains her most crucial relationships, not with Spanish grandees or foreign ambassadors, but with her brother Leopold I in Vienna. These letters, written in cipher and carried by trusted couriers, reveal the true architect of Spain's defensive strategy against an enemy that grows stronger with each passing year. Bourbon, France. The 9 Years' War engulfs Europe from 1688 to 1697, and Spain bleeds treasure and territory like a wounded giant. French armies seize Spanish fortresses in the Low Countries, while French fleets challenge Spanish control of Mediterranean trade routes. Every battle lost makes Spanish weakness more obvious. Every treaty signed surrenders another piece of the empire Philip II once ruled from Madrid to Manila. Mariana's documented correspondence reveals a mind still sharp despite advancing age and accumulating defeats. She coordinates with Leopold to ensure Austrian and Spanish policies complement each other rather than competing for limited resources. When Spanish armies cannot hold Catalonia, Austrian forces create diversions in Italy. When Spanish finances collapse, Austrian loans provide temporary relief. But the shadow of French power grows longer with each diplomatic season. Louis XIV commands the largest army in Europe, controls the continent's most efficient tax system, and rules a population 3 times larger than Spain's. His ambassador in Madrid reports directly to Versailles about Charles II's deteriorating health and obvious incapacity for producing heirs. Partition schemes begin circulating in European courts like funeral plans for a dying patient. French, Austrian, and English diplomats secretly negotiate the division of Spanish territories among powers capable of ruling them effectively. These conversations treat Spain as a corpse to be carved up, rather than a sovereign nation with rights and interests. Mariana recognizes the game being played around her son's empty cradle. She maintains Spain's dignity while acknowledging its diminished capacity for independent action. Her strategy focuses on preserving as much Spanish territory as possible for whoever inherits Charles's crown, whether that heir comes from Vienna, Versailles, or some compromise candidate acceptable to European powers. The irony becomes inescapable. The most inbred queen in European history must now navigate the diplomatic consequences of her dynasty's genetic obsessions. Every childless year of Charles's marriage strengthens foreign claims to Spanish succession. Every obvious sign of the king's incapacity makes partition schemes more attractive to powers seeking stability over legitimacy. Mariana's final diplomatic triumph involves positioning Habsburg Austria as Spain's natural protector against French absorption. She argues, through intermediaries and correspondence, that Austrian rule would preserve Spanish territorial integrity better than French conquest or English partition. Her brother Leopold represents continuity with Spanish traditions, sharing the same bloodline that created the current crisis. But time runs shorter with each diplomatic season. Charles shows no signs of producing heirs, and European patience with Spanish weakness approaches its limits. The War of the Spanish Succession looms on the horizon like a storm everyone can see coming, but no one possesses the power to prevent. May 16, 1696. You stand in the corridors of the Alcazar Palace as whispered news spreads like plague through rooms where Mariana of Austria has ruled, schemed, and survived for more than 30 years. The Queen Mother lies dying in chambers decorated with portraits of children who preceded her to the grave and territories that slipped away during her regency. The end comes with the dignity she maintained throughout her life, surrounded by Spanish grandees who had once plotted her downfall and confessors who had guided her through decades of impossible choices. Contemporary accounts mention her final words were prayers for Spain rather than concerns about personal salvation, though such details often reflect political propaganda more than historical fact. Her funeral procession through Madrid draws crowds that remember her not as the Austrian girl who married her uncle, but as the widow who held their empire together when lesser rulers might have surrendered to forces beyond their control. The black-draped hearse carries a woman who transformed from political pawn to master player in the great game of European power. Burial at El Escorial places her among the Spanish royalty she served rather than the Austrian nobility who birthed her. The magnificent mausoleum Philip II, built for his dynasty, receives another Habsburg body, but this one earned her place through decades of service rather than accidents of birth. Her tomb bears inscriptions in Latin that emphasize her role as mother and regent rather than her origins as archduchess. The timing of her death creates one final irony in a life defined by unintended consequences. She does not live to witness Charles II's death in 1700, the event that will trigger the War of the Spanish Succession and fulfill every dire prediction about Spanish Habsburg decline. She dies believing her son might yet produce heirs, that her dynasty might yet recover from its genetic catastrophes. European courts received news of Mariana's death with diplomatic regret and private relief. She represented the old system of dynastic marriage politics that had created the current crisis. Her passing removes a skilled but ultimately obsolete player from a game whose rules were changing beyond recognition. Spain mourns a queen mother who had become more Spanish than her Spanish-born critics, whose Austrian birth mattered less than her fierce defense of Spanish interests against foreign encroachment. But mourning cannot change the fundamental reality her death makes obvious. The Spanish Habsburg line dies with her generation, and everyone knows it. You stand now at the window of history, looking back across centuries at a woman whose life embodied both the grandeur and the horror of dynastic politics taken to their logical extreme. Mariana of Austria was not the most inbred person who ever lived. That distinction belongs to her son, Charles II. But she stood at the center of one of history's most concentrated experiments in bloodline purity, and her story reveals the human cost of treating royal children like breeding stock. The Habsburg look became a political brand that concealed a biological warning. Those distinctive features, painted by court artists as marks of divine appointment, were actually genetic red flags, nature's way of signaling that bloodlines had become too closed, too concentrated, too obsessed with purity over survival. What they called breeding, we would recognize as inbreeding. What they painted as beauty, biology would reveal as deformity. Mariana's paradox defines her historical significance. A queen forged by the very system that ultimately destroyed her dynasty, yet possessed of the intelligence and tenacity to delay that destruction for decades. She was both product and victim of Habsburg marriage politics, but also their most skillful practitioner. Her regency proved that the most inbred queen in European history could govern more effectively than most kings. The arithmetic of blood always balances eventually. 3 centuries of uncle-niece marriages, cousin-cousin unions, and calculated inbreeding created genetic debts that accumulated with each generation until they could no longer be ignored or painted over by court artists. Charles II's twisted body represented the final accounting, the moment when biology presented its bill for centuries of defying natural law. Yet Mariana's individual story transcends the genetic catastrophe that defined her era. She arrived in Spain as a teenage pawn and transformed herself into a master player who held together an empire that should have collapsed decades earlier. Her intelligence, courage, and political skill proved that even the most constrained circumstances cannot completely determine individual destiny. Contemporary observers who dismissed her as merely another Habsburg broodmare failed to recognize the strategic mind behind those allegedly inbred features. She outmaneuvered Spanish grandees who underestimated her because of her gender and foreign birth. She survived palace coups that should have destroyed her regency. She maintained Spanish territorial integrity against French expansion that might have absorbed the entire peninsula. Her death in 1696 marked the end of an era when royal bloodlines mattered more than royal competence, when marriage politics trumped biological reality, when dynasties convinced themselves that genetic concentration equaled political strength. The War of the Spanish Succession that followed Charles II's death 4 years later would establish new rules for European power based on military capacity and economic strength rather than bloodline purity. Picture Mariana in her final years, a woman in black silk standing at a palace window, watching Spanish sunsets while European powers circled like vultures around her son's empty cradle. She understood that her dynasty was dying, but she fought for it anyway because fighting was all she knew. In her dedication to a cause already lost, she achieved a kind of tragic nobility that transcends the genetic horror story that defined her era. The most inbred queen in European history became, perhaps paradoxically, one of its most effective rulers. Her story reminds us that individual character can triumph over systemic failure, that intelligence and will can overcome even the worst circumstances, and that sometimes the most unlikely people prove capable of extraordinary things when history demands it of them. In the end, Mariana of Austria was both warning and inspiration, a demonstration of what happens when power becomes too concentrated, but also proof that even victims of impossible circumstances can find ways to make their lives matter. Her legacy lives not in the bloodline that died with her son, but in the example she set of how to maintain dignity and purpose, even when serving a cause that history had already condemned. If you enjoyed this tragic story, I made a full documentary about Mariana's son, Charles II. You can watch it next.